Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Julian had always believed that stability was the clearest sign of mature love. Over the 5 years he spent sharing his life with Clara, he learned to respect her quirks, her silences, the good days and the ones that weren't so great. She, in turn, seemed to find in him a safe harbor. Together, they'd built a quiet routine filled with small traditions that gave meaning to everyday life, from Sunday lunches to carefully chosen Friday night movies. Nothing flashy, just a solid life, the kind he liked to call it. He was proud of it. And for a long time, he believed she was too. The first time he heard the name Dominic, it came up in a casual conversation about reconnecting with old college friends. Clara mentioned he'd shown up at a scientific event she'd attended and they'd exchanged contacts. Julian responded with indifference, giving only a slight nod of agreement. At the time, there was no reason to think anything more than a renewed friendship was going on. It was common, natural, even positive, he told himself. Seeing Clara excited about her own connections made him believe she was expanding her world. That was part of being a couple, cheering each other on. But slowly, this new person started showing up too often in their conversations. There'd always be some comment about an idea Dominic had, a compliment about his intelligence, or a funny thing she'd heard and wanted to share. Week by week, his name was mentioned more than any other colleague or friend. Julian stayed attentive but chose to trust. He listened without interrupting, holding his doubts inside. Insecurity, when love is involved, usually hides behind silence. The problem wasn't in the words, it was in the details. One random Tuesday, she mentioned she was meeting Dominic for coffee after work because he wanted to discuss a research proposal. Nothing alarming yet. The discomfort came when it kept happening. Twice a week. Then almost every day. Sometimes she didn't even tell him. She'd come home later, blaming extended meetings, traffic, or a quick stop to grab something to eat. Julian preferred not to confront her. He watched. He mentally noted every small change in the routine, every extra hour that conveniently appeared, every message she received and quickly turned away to read. Her clothes changed too. Clara, who used to dress simply for everyday life, began choosing her outfits more carefully, even on days when there was nothing special planned. He noticed different perfumes, more deliberate makeup on ordinary days. And every time she said she'd be back soon, she stayed out long enough that he stopped believing her. Still, Julian took deep breaths and tried to rationalize. Maybe he was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just a phase. Then one night, he saw Clara laughing quietly at her phone, typing messages with heart emojis, and finally asked. He was careful. Said he'd been feeling a little disconnected from her, that he noticed her attention drifting elsewhere. Clara reacted with impatience. She rolled her eyes, tossed the phone onto the couch, and said the phrase that would become routine from then on, "You're overreacting. He's just a friend." The tone was sharp, as if Julian had committed a crime by doubting the purity of a friendship. From then on, every time he brought it up, he got the same defense. Sometimes accompanied by irritation, other times sarcasm, occasionally outright disdain. Clara started accusing him of controlling her life, being too jealous, suffocating her freedom. It hurt. Not because he hadn't expected this kind of reaction, but because suddenly everything they'd built seemed to crumble over a stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere. A stranger who was getting more time, attention, and affection than the man who'd been beside her for years. Julian tried convincing himself it was just a passing phase. He tried being more affectionate, more understanding, more patient. He surprised her with dinners, sent messages during the day. Clara thanked him, but with the distance of someone doing it out of obligation. And sometimes, she seemed annoyed by his attempts to draw closer. She started hiding her phone, putting it on silent even at home. She even set a new password without explanation. When Julian asked why, she said she needed to protect work data. He just nodded. It was easier to pretend he believed her than to endure another argument. The nights grew longer. Julian would lie down and pretend to sleep while listening to Clara laugh softly on calls in the living room. One early morning, he got up for water and found her on the sofa, video calling Dominic. She made up an excuse, something urgent about their project. He went back to bed without saying a word. He realized the worst part wasn't being cheated on, it was being treated like a stranger in his own home. Still, he held on. Tried to find plausible explanations. Clung to the hope that all of it was just a string of coincidences. But the coincidences started forming patterns. She began going out alone on weekends, claiming she needed space to breathe. And when she came back, she avoided any display of affection. Kisses became quick pecks. Hugs turned into light pats on the shoulder. And the looks, the ones that used to say everything, now avoided his entirely. Julian felt something slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to hold on anymore. He feared invading her space, forcing things, becoming the kind of man he swore he'd never be. But a pain grew every day, the pain of being invisible. He was beside her every day, but no longer part of her life. It was like living in the echo of something that had already ended, except no one had the courage to say so. So he chose silence. Not as an escape, but as a strategy. He realized anything he said would be used against him. From that moment on, he listened more than he spoke. Observed more than he reacted. Deep down, a decision began to form, still undefined, but firm. He knew something had to change. And this time, he wouldn't be the one begging for attention. Clara, without realizing it, had stopped being a partner and become a mystery. And Julian, exhausted from decoding excuses, started looking for answers elsewhere, away from empty promises, away from rehearsed justifications, away from the phrase that had become an insult to his intelligence, "He's just a friend." Julian decided that if Clara felt free to lie, he deserved the same right to seek answers without asking permission. He no longer saw sense in talking, explaining feelings, or trying to reconnect something only he seemed willing to preserve. That phase of doubt had turned into painful clarity. And though it hurt, he was ready to face whatever came next. That's when he remembered Everett Collins, a childhood acquaintance, now retired from the police force, working quietly as a private investigator. He called one afternoon, explained the basics, and set up a meeting without giving many details. When they met, all it took was Julian's look for Everett to understand the gravity of the situation. Avoiding fluff was something they both shared. Julian laid out exactly what was happening. Showed screenshots he'd saved, talked about the repeated meetings with Dominic, the increasing time Clara spent away from home, the inconsistent alibis, the calls that ended the moment he walked into the room. Everett listened in silence, without judgment, taking notes. In just over an hour, the plan was set. He'd follow Clara for a few days, document every movement, record everything, and deliver only the facts. Julian didn't demand speed. He just wanted the truth, raw, unfiltered, no embellishments. He knew a part of him still hoped he was wrong. But another part, growing stronger every day, was already preparing to confirm what his heart refused to accept. In the days that followed, Julian tried to keep up his routine. Woke up early, went to work, came home, made dinner. Clara stuck to her professional commitments. She smiled, said she was swamped, but her tone was lighter than someone overwhelmed. Sometimes she forgot to pretend she was tired. She came home too energized, too happy, with a sparkle in her eyes that no longer belonged to him. Julian watched it all and pretended not to notice. They slept in the same bed, but he no longer felt her there. It was like living with a visitor who never said goodbye. Meanwhile, Everett worked in silence. After 4 days, Julian got a message, "We can talk. I got what you need." The meeting was quick and direct. Everett handed him a flash drive, some printed photos, and a small folder of notes. He didn't say much. Just, "You deserve to know who you're sharing your life with." Julian thanked him with a handshake, went home, and sat for a few minutes staring at the sealed envelope. It felt like opening it would tear apart the last remnants of their relationship. But delaying the inevitable didn't matter anymore. He turned on the computer, inserted the drive, and pressed play. The images hit like blunt punches. Dominic and Clara in a fancy bar, sitting too close for just a chat. She wore a blue dress she'd claimed was too old for dates with Julian. In another photo, they walked side by side along the riverbank. In a third, they hugged in a parking lot, smiling like starry-eyed teenagers. But it was the video recorded in Dominic's office elevator that erased any doubt, a long, intimate kiss, natural and effortless, as if they were a couple comfortable with their betrayal. The final piece of evidence was the receipt for a cabin reservation at Lake Hartwell. Clara had used her personal email, the one she insisted she only used for social media. The date matched the weekend she'd claimed to be attending a course out of town. Dominic's name was listed as the responsible party, but photos showed Clara in the passenger seat of his car, a suitcase on her lap. Julian read every line, viewed every frame, and at the end, said nothing. Didn't shout. Didn't cry. Just closed the folder, deleted the video from the screen, and rested his arms on the table. That was it. The truth was right in front of him, ugly, cold, calculated. What hurt most wasn't the kiss, the trip, the cabin. It was the way Clara smiled, as if she were living a parallel chapter of her life, guilt-free, unrestrained. The fact that she came home after each of those encounters, hugged him, lied to his eyes, slept beside him like the most faithful woman in the world. That burned more than any image ever could. The next day, Julian did what he had to. He went to the bank and separated his finances. He froze joint accounts, removed Clara from his dependents list, transferred his investments to another name. He gave the safe key to a trusted friend. He contacted his lawyer and filed paperwork to update asset records. There was no room left for dialogue, let alone justification. From then on, their relationship would be reduced to documents, clauses, contractual lines. And he'd handle it all with the coldness of someone forced to grow up in a cruel way. Clara carried on as before. Cheek kisses, brief smiles, comments about traffic, work, a friend going through a romantic crisis and needing to talk. Julian replied with short phrases, economical gestures. His absence was starting to weigh on her, but she didn't realize it was new, and final. He'd already left, on the inside. He wasn't searching for answers anymore. He wasn't seeking redemption. The game was over. Only the final scene remained, and he would be the director. At the end of that week, he received confirmation from Everett about the cabin's address and the new stay Clara and Dominic had booked. Julian didn't hesitate. He called Marcus, a longtime friend and business partner, someone who knew how to keep quiet and already knew the story. "I need you to come with me. It'll be quick." Marcus didn't question it. They were aligned. It was time to close a chapter, with clarity, with documentation, and above all, with proof. Because while Clara smiled in front of him like she was still fooling someone, Julian already carried silently the certainty of everything she'd done. And soon, she'd see that the quiet man she'd ignored for weeks was the only one who knew the whole truth. The cabin gate was slightly open, the light inside cutting through the dark like a cynical invitation. Julian parked a few feet away, and Marcus positioned his phone on the dashboard, recording. Both knew exactly what they were doing. Despite the natural tension, their mood was focused. Julian stepped out first and knocked firmly. The delay before the door opened confirmed what they already knew. When it finally opened, Clara appeared with her hair hastily tied up in a beige robe Julian recognized well. Shock widened her face for a second. She froze. Right behind her, Dominic appeared shirtless, holding two glasses. Julian said nothing. took his phone from his pocket and showed the screen playing the footage, the walk along the river, the kiss in the elevator, the recordings of them arriving at the cabin the night before. Clara stepped back. Tried to hide her face with her hand, as if covering her eyes could erase what was in front of her. Dominic tried to intervene, stammering something about privacy, but Marcus stepped into frame with his other phone, filming from a different angle. That was enough to make them both retreat. Julian simply said, "You have until Sunday to take your things out of the apartment. After that, I'm changing the locks." Then he turned around. The walk back was silent. Marcus offered a ride to Julian's parents' house, but Julian preferred to drive alone. When he got home, he went straight to the bedroom and started packing Clara's belongings into boxes. Shirts, books, perfumes, accessories, all wrapped carefully, without tearing, without destroying. Each box sealed with tape, labeled with her name, stacked in the corner of the living room. During the process, he received 3 messages. Then 7 more. Clara alternated between guilt, denial, and childish excuses. One said, "It's not what you think." Julian read it and deleted it. The attempt to regain control had begun, and he knew it would be long. The next morning, Clara showed up at the apartment with Vivian, her mother, who immediately accused Julian of sexism, harassment, setting a trap to humiliate her. Julian stayed silent. Opened the door, pointed to the boxes, and said they could take everything. Vivian kept talking, pointing fingers, trying to attract neighbors' attention. Clara, on the other hand, looked confused, between tears and anger, but couldn't meet his eyes. As they carried the boxes out, Marcus arrived, this time to ensure nothing was taken without authorization. Seeing him, Vivian fell silent. Clara grabbed the last box and left without a word. From then on, the second phase began, the war over the narrative. Within a week, Clara posted a vague social media message about being the victim of a controlling relationship, using hashtags about emotional abuse and overcoming trauma. Many of her friends commented with supportive words, some even shared the post. Julian received messages from mutual acquaintances asking what had happened. He replied to all with the same text, "I have everything documented. If anyone wants to see it, I'm available." None of them asked. Vivian started sending emails demanding compensation for moral damages, claiming Clara had been publicly humiliated. Julian forwarded everything to his lawyer. No direct response was given. Instead, notifications multiplied. Penelope, Clara's best friend, who'd been used as an excuse on one of the nights Clara spent with Dominic, showed up at the building entrance, eyes full of rage. She said she was disappointed, felt used, and would never forgive Clara. She revealed Clara had told her she was with her that night, when in fact she was staying at the cabin. Penelope never spoke to her again. Others drifted away too. One by one, they realized the facts didn't support the victim story Clara was trying to spread. Dominic disappeared. Stopped being mentioned, deleted photos, removed comments. Without the support she expected, Clara intensified the pressure. She tried contacting Julian's co-workers, messaging family members, seeking any way to destabilize him emotionally. None of it worked. Julian stayed steady. He didn't retaliate, didn't expose details, just kept everything carefully documented. Over time, the attacks began to seem desperate. She created an anonymous profile to leave offensive comments on Julian's photos. Got caught. Used other people's names to find out if he was seeing someone else. Even sent flowers to his office, signed, "An old admirer," hoping to cause confusion. Julian had blocked every possible path. A restraining order was requested, and approved without resistance, thanks to the evidence. Clara received the notice in shock. Julian learned through others that she cried leaving the courthouse. Meanwhile, Julian's routine took on new shapes. He cleaned the house of every trace of their past life. Repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, disposed of gifts she'd given him over the years. Donated books, sold personal items, started visiting places he once avoided. Rediscovered old hobbies, returned to cooking, reconnected with friends. At a dinner with a group he hadn't seen in months, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: lightness. It wasn't euphoria. It was rebuilding. Julian preferred silence to exaggerated celebrations. He knew true victory didn't come from confrontation, but from clarity. And it had been won through quiet, consistent, undeniable actions. Every attempt Clara made to flip the narrative, beg for pity, erase the traces of what she'd done, only reinforced the magnitude of the truth she'd tried to hide. And without realizing it, she kept handing over more pieces of her own guilt. Slowly, her name faded from conversations. Messages became rare. Provocations, useless. The story Clara wanted to tell lost space to the reality Julian chose to write with his own hands. And even though there was pain in the process, there was also peace that didn't rely on explanations or revenge. Just the certainty that he'd walked out whole, even after being broken. Julian reorganized his life with surgical precision. After all the chaos, he didn't want any leftover traces of pain scattered around the apartment. Clara's boxes were gone, and with them, memories that bound him to a past that no longer made sense. Little by little, he created new rituals. He woke earlier, made his own coffee slowly, and listened to music he used to share with her, but now meant something different. It was as if he was reclaiming his own choices, freeing sounds, tastes, and gestures from the weight of memory. At work, colleagues approached cautiously, wondering how he'd managed to go through it all without falling apart. Some expected to find a bitter man. Instead, they found someone focused, quietly productive. Julian answered only what was necessary, and that earned even more respect. When asked about Clara, he simply said some choices reveal truths that cohabitation hides. Nobody pressed further. It was clear he'd moved on in a rare way, without needing to destroy the other to rebuild himself. Friday nights, once reserved for two-person dinners and repeat movies, were now filled with books. Julian made a list of everything he'd always wanted to read and kept postponing. He found joy in turning pages without interruptions, without late-night messages intruding, without competing for attention with a phone. He discovered that silence, once feared, could be a gift. One Saturday afternoon, he decided to renovate the apartment. Changed the curtains, bought a new set of dishes, rearranged the paintings. Simple things, but symbolic. A home that had once been a stage for suspicion would now be a place of calm. He started cooking for himself, even when alone, as a form of self-care. He tried recipes Clara had always called boring, and rediscovered flavors she'd never bothered to understand. In these small acts, he rebuilt his self-worth layer by layer. One morning, leaving the bakery, he saw Dominic across the street. Alone, staring at his phone, distracted. Julian thought for a moment about crossing over, confronting him, saying everything he'd never said. But he chose to keep walking. Dominic never deserved the weight of the anger Julian once carried. He was complicit, yes. But the one who hurt him was someone who claimed to love. Letting go of resentment was the final key to freeing himself from the story. And he'd come too far to turn back. Weeks later, the doorbell rang. It was a delivery person with a sealed cardboard box and no return address. Inside, a handwritten letter and a necklace Julian had given Clara on their 3rd anniversary. The letter, written in messy, crossed-out words, apologized. Said she was ashamed. Never thought he'd have the courage to see it through. Believed that even if caught, he'd give in. Said his silence had been more devastating than any scream. Julian folded the letter carefully, tucked it into a folder, and locked it deep in a drawer he rarely opened. The necklace, he took to a pawn shop and used the money to buy a used camera. He'd wanted to photograph again for a long time, and now he had a new reason to leave the house often. Over time, he started taking short weekend trips. Visited nearby towns, wandered through craft fairs, explored hidden cafes. Posted occasional photos on social media with simple captions. Never mentioned the past. People began to take interest in the pictures, and some suggested he create a dedicated profile. He did, under a discreet name, never revealing it was his. Seeing strangers comment and share his images felt, in a quiet way, like silent validation. He wasn't the betrayed man anymore. He was the man who turned a breakup into a new path. On one of those trips, while photographing in a small village, an elderly woman approached and praised his patience adjusting the camera's focus. She said her husband had passed away, and since then, she saw beauty in things others overlooked. Julian smiled, and they talked for a long time. She didn't know his story, but she said something that echoed in his mind for days: pain we hold without rushing becomes wisdom. He thanked her with a handshake and walked on. He didn't need to explain anything. Some time later, Clara made one last attempt to reach out. Sent a short message: "I just wanted to know if you're okay." Julian read it, paused for a moment, and archived it. He understood this was just another way of tugging on a loose thread. She hoped he'd reply, even just to argue. But he was too whole now to offer space to someone who'd torn everything apart so lightly. Ignoring wasn't disrespect. It was self-protection. A clear, final boundary. At his sister's birthday dinner, Julian made an unexpected toast. He thanked everyone for everything he'd lived through in the past year. Said he'd learned that sometimes truth only appears when you stop asking for explanations and start paying attention. His mother hugged him, moved. Everyone knew the pain he'd endured, but no one had ever seen him play the victim. Julian didn't want to be remembered as the man who was cheated on. He wanted to be remembered as the one who rebuilt himself in silence. That same night, at home, he stared at a photo he'd taken of himself in the mirror. He looked different. Thinner, stubble, calm gaze. The man in the photo had survived a war, but didn't carry its dirt. He was someone who'd lost everything false and gained everything true. The absence of noise, urgency, imbalance, it was enough. When a new neighbor moved into the apartment next door, he helped her with some boxes. They exchanged smiles, chatted about small things, laughed at a dumb joke. She thanked him with coffee and said she missed kind neighbors. Julian accepted the coffee but didn't offer his number. Not because he'd shut himself off to new connections, but because he'd learned to value the right timing. Rushing had caused too much damage already. And on that quiet Sunday, sitting at the table with a cup in hand, he realized something. The day he said, "You're right," to Clara hadn't been a sign of weakness. It was the exact moment he chose to stop fighting for something that existed only on one side. That tiny phrase was a dividing line. In that moment, he stopped being an extension of someone else's pain and became the author of his own story. There was no bitterness there, only peace. And for the first time in a long time, he was exactly where he wanted to be. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.